you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a senior associate here at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about options for E-2 visas with lower investment amounts in businesses often considered high risk, such as real estate, equity trading firms, and consulting businesses. But just a few things before we get started with the webinar. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the U.S. on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN-B, and an H-1B. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in different areas, including the E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, such as those with lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We'll also send the link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We also send you a link where you can arrange for a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So today we are lucky to have our partner, Kelly Weiner, present the webinar. Kelly is a Harvard business-trained partner and an expert in corporate and employment-based immigration. She has extensive experience working with E-2s, especially those that are considered higher risk. So without further delay, we will get started with the webinar.
Thank you, Katie. So we can just go to the first slide.
Okay.
All right, so let's start by talking about what are the E-2 visa requirements. So the first requirement for this is that you have to be a national of a treaty country. So that means you have to have a passport for one of the countries that has a treaty with the United States that authorizes the E-2. And there are over 80 E-2 treaty countries, including countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, the Middle East, and North America. And the list does change sometimes. So for example, the last several years, New Zealand, Israel, and Portugal were added to the list. So always good to kind of check and see if there's been any changes, because this is once there is a change, you can apply for the E-2 visa. So you have to own at least 50% in the E-2 company, and you have to make a substantial investment. So this is an investor visa, and this is often where a lot of the questions come in. So you have to put your funds at risk. That means that you can't get this visa by opening a business bank account and just transferring a lump sum of money into it. The money actually has to be spent or committed, put at risk such that it could, the investor risks loss, in the commercial sense if the business does not work out. You also have to demonstrate that your investment comes from a legitimate source. So this is called the source of funds requirement, and they have to be the investor's personal funds. This can be kind of personal savings from employment. It can be a gift. It can be sale of personal property, or a loan on personal property. The loan can also be unsecured. The one loan that doesn't work is you cannot have a loan that is secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So this comes up a lot kind of in seller financing situations, maybe where you're purchasing a business and you put down a certain amount to purchase it, but the rest is seller financing secured by the E-2 company. So that arrangement does not really work for an E-2. Another important thing to note about a gift is that the gift giver would need to feel comfortable providing their financial documentation to show where they got the money. So if you're getting a gift, for example, from your mother, and she got it from the sale of her house, she would have to provide the purchase sale agreement and then proof of her getting the money from the sale of the house and transferring it to the investor. In terms of how much is enough, we'll kind of go over this on more slides or on other slides, but you want to be thinking about what are the reasonable costs to set up whatever type of business I'm planning to start. Typical E-2 expenditures would be things like inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, commercial space rent, marketing, business entity setup, anything that's needed to kind of get the business up and running. So this will be specific to your type of business. There are certain businesses, for example, a restaurant, a manufacturer, where you're going to have much higher costs, a lot more that needs to be purchased versus kind of smaller service-based businesses. Maybe there's going to be kind of a smaller investment. You're going to have to be more strategic about how you spend your money. All right, so moving down the E-2 visa requirements, another requirement is the business cannot be marginal. This means the business has to support more than just the investor and their family in the United States. And if you're doing a startup, the regulations say the business needs to be able to realize that kind of significant economic contribution within at least a period of 5 years. The way that this works out is you really have to hire US employees to show that you meet the marginality requirement. They want to show that the business is supporting more than just you and your family. And this is a very important part of the E-2 application, particularly at the renewal stage. If you haven't hired anybody before you get your E-2, this is generally fine, but what you do need is a comprehensive 5-year business plan that lays out a realistic hiring plan, showing that you're going to hire people. We usually recommend showing that you'll hire at least 3 to 5 full-time employees over that 5-year period. But it could be more, kind of depending on what type of business you're starting. Another requirement is the business has to be real and operating. So if you are, for example, purchasing an existing business, you're going to show things like tax returns, licenses, kind of invoices, W-2s. If you are starting up a new business, then to prove that the business is real and operating, what you need to show is that everything is in place such that the business can start to operate once you get your visa. So these would be things like signing a commercial lease, setting up your business entity, making sure your website is ready. If you have any kind of contracts or letters of intent with prospective clients, you could include that. You've acquired the licenses that you need to run the business. So these types of setup activities just show that once you do get your visa, you'll be able to start operating the business, within a short time frame. Another requirement is that you must be coming to the US to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So the E-2 is not for someone that wants to kind of retire, in the United States. You do actually need to be coming to, take an active hand in the business. Usually you'll demonstrate kind of that you meet this develop and direct requirement by showing that you own a majority of the company or at least 50%, or more, and that you're actually going to operate the business generally kind of as an executive or as a director on kind of high level activities. You also have to show that you have the intent to return to your home country upon expiration of the E-2 visa. So it is kind of a visa that requires that intent to depart. That being said, the language friendly in the sense that it says you can move your entire residence to the United States. You can renew this visa indefinitely, but you do have to still maintain that intent that if the visa, status were to end, that you would depart the United States, unless you have kind of red flags in your application, like you filed an immigrant, petition, or you've, tried to get a green card in the past, or you have immigration violations. Very often kind of you can satisfy this requirement just by signing a piece of paper that, says your intent to depart, if or when the visa status ends. For the E-2, you can either start a business or you can buy a business. So there's kind of different, pros and cons to each. Starting a business, you have total control. You kind of can choose where to invest your money. You don't have any kind of maybe negative history to talk about, but it is more speculative. If you're buying a business, one kind of big advantage here is that if it's a successful business, which usually if you're going for an E-2, you want to buy a business where, it has a proven history of hiring people and also has, kind of consistent or growing revenues and profits. So that can be very, favorable for showing that the company already meets many of the E-2 requirements. Another big benefit of buying a business is that you can protect your investment a bit more. For a startup, you actually have to spend the money on various startup expenditures. When you're buying a business, you can potentially use an escrow arrangement. And what this means is that you would sign the purchase sale agreement, with the seller. You would say all conditions, to kind of give the money, to the seller have been satisfied except for the approval of the E-2 visa. And then instead of sending the purchase price directly to the seller, you would send it to an objective, third party escrow agent. And that escrow agent will have a set of instructions that says if the E-2 visa is, approved, the money will go to the seller. But if the E-2 visa is denied, the money will go to the buyer. So, of course, you do have to have a seller that's willing to work with that arrangement, but it can be a really good way to protect, your investment, just in case the E-2 is not approved. All right, how long is the E-2 valid for? So when you're getting a visa stamp at a consulate, the length of time the visa will be granted for is dependent on something called a reciprocity schedule. So the U.S. has kind of these reciprocal agreements with other countries as to how long they will grant these types of visas. That's to say that not everybody will get the same length visa. So, for example, some countries may have a visa validity of only 3 months. Bangladesh, Egypt, these are countries where that's the case. Whereas, countries like the UK or Canada, people can get a visa that is a multiple entry 5-year visa. The officers do have this ability to kind of limit the duration of the visa. So, for example, in Canada, they can grant a 5-year visa if they felt the business was very speculative, if they felt like they wanted to see, the investor back sooner, they could hypothetically grant the visa for less time. In recent years, they haven't really done that. There was a period of time, for example, where the UK was granting a lot of 3-year visas instead of 5-year. We really haven't seen that much, in the past few years, but it is always, their discretion to do so. No matter how long your visa is valid for, whether it's valid for 3 months or it's valid for 5 years, it is an entry document. It does not govern your status once you enter the United States. So it has to be valid. The visa has to be valid for you to apply to enter the United States with the visa. But once you enter, you're going to get a status document called an I-94. And the I-94 is what shows that you have valid status in the United States. So there's an online system where you can check this every time you enter the United States. And every time you enter, you can be given 2 years in E-2 status. So even if you have a 3-month visa, when you enter, you can be given 2 years in E-2 status. If you have a 5-year visa, when you enter, you can be given 2 years in E-2 status. And you will need to depart before that 2 years is up. So if you have a 5-year visa, it can be quite simple, right? You can just travel freely during that time. So every 2 years or even more frequently, if you're going back to your home country. If you do have a visa that has a shorter validity period, like a 3-month visa or a 1-year visa, then you may be in a position of whenever you leave, you would then need to go back to the consulate, present details about the business, and get a new visa stamp before you could re-enter. All right, so let's turn to the question of investment and how much investment is enough. This is a very common question because there is no kind of set dollar figure. For example, there's an EB-5 green card application where you have to invest a certain dollar figure. That's not the case for the E-2. The regulations say you have to invest a substantial amount of money. As we've noted here, an investment is normally going to be greater than 50,000. They do apply this kind of proportionality test and look at the type of business. So they're going to look at what are the normal costs to set up this type of business, and then how much have you spent of those normal costs. So you can kind of try to define for the officer, here's what you would normally spend to set up, for example, a consulting business or a law firm. And look, I've spent 100% of that, or I've spent well over, what that would be. Because there are some places, some articles, like industry articles, that will say, yes, you can start up a law firm for as low as $10,000. And while that may generally be true, it's still not going to be a high enough investment to really make for a successful E-2 application, because you do have to show that you've committed a substantial amount that convinces the officer that the investor is really going to actively work to make this business successful. So even though it depends on the type of business, and some businesses are hypothetically could be started with investments of just a couple thousand. Again, your investment is normally going to be greater than 50,000, not necessarily all of that spent, but a good proportion of that spent. And it may be much higher depending on the type of business that you're starting. So, for example, if you're starting up a car manufacturing company, obviously that's going to have much higher startup costs. You're not going to be able to, get an E-2 for that with just an investment of 50,000 because it's very unlikely you'll convince an officer you've actually spent everything necessary to get a car manufacturing plant up and running if all you've spent is 50,000. Important to know as well on the proportionality test, if the investment is of a huge magnitude. So if you're doing kind of a commercial real estate development and the total costs over the years will be 50 million and you've invested 10 million, the magnitude of your investment might be high enough that they would still grant the E-2 visa, even though the percentage of amount that you've spent of the total startup cost is lower. That being said, most of the investors that we're dealing with, and when we talk about these kind of higher risk cases with lower investment amounts, you want to be able to say you spent 100% of what's necessary to get this business up and running. When you're talking about the proportionality test for buying a business, generally they will consider that if you've paid the fair market value for the business, that's going to be considered substantial. If this is an arm's length transaction, the purchase price that on the open market is generally going to be considered the fair market value. That being said, if you are purchasing a business from a family member, if you're purchasing a business from a friend, and you would want to make sure that you either have a kind of objective valuation of the business of the purchase price and at the very least the purchase price should make sense in light of the financials. So if the business financials show high profits, high assets, a very successful company, and your purchase price is extremely low for 50% and you're buying it from your brother, they're going to look at that and they may not consider that to be a substantial investment. So you do want to make sure that you've provided some background explanation for how you've reached this purchase price, particularly if you're, purchasing from someone where it's not an arm's length transaction. All right, let's talk about some strategies to deal with a low investment amount. So if you do have a lower investment amount, it's very important that all other parts of the application are as strong as possible. So marginality, real and operating, kind of ideally the investor will have a background successfully running this type of business or similar types of businesses. It can be very helpful to hire an employee before you file or to get kind of letters of intent or contracts showing, real interest in the company's products or services. Things you can do, you can obtain a Chamber of Commerce letter. So sometimes you can join the local Chamber of Commerce where your business will be located, maybe have an initial meeting with them, talk about how your business will bring jobs, and kind of, revenue into the local economy, and they may be willing to write a letter supporting, the application. You can have similar kind of favorable relationships with other relevant, industry business organizations, and things like that can be very helpful as well. If there are any kind of ongoing company activity, any sales, let's say you have a U.S. business partner, maybe who started to run the company, while you're still waiting to get your visa, you can always include that, those bank statements or those contracts. A strong business plan is really key, especially with a low investment amount. You want to show kind of here is our realistic hiring plan, here is our realistic financial plan. This is why the business will be able to operate with the amount of kind of investment that we have put in. Again, hiring US employees prior to applying will always kind of strengthen your case. Sometimes people will, for example, hire a part-time office assistant to help them with some of their initial startup activities, while if they're not able to be in the United States during that time. Another thing you could consider is going to a CPA who works with kind of businesses in your industry and having them assess your investment and your business plan and write a letter discussing why this is a reasonable investment amount for this type of business. So those are all kind of strategies you can use if you are applying with a lower investment amount. Okay, let's turn to some common E-2 visa expenditures. So kind of what can you spend your money on? Website. Most businesses are going to need a website. It's also very common that an officer, if they're going to review a case, is going to go to the company website. So you do want to either have that active or make sure that it's clear in your application that if it's not active yet, that it's already set up and you do have it, ready to be active once you get your visa. Computer, printer, scanners, anything that you need kind of technology equipment wise to run your business. inventory, if you have the type of business that does have inventory, and this can be purchased, from another country. It's not a requirement that you purchase, things in the United States. That being said, it is very recommended that you do that. It's something the officers will look at. The purpose of the visa is kind of to, bring economic benefit, to the United States. So it's definitely beneficial to purchase things in the United States if you have the option. Furniture can be included, but again, only for business purposes. So it does not work, for example, to say, well, I'm going to work at my dining room table. So I'm going to put my dining room table set, as a business expense. Those types of things they will flag, and they do weaken your case. Trademark or intellectual property purchase or development can be included. Sweat equity is not something that is included, but if you have, intellectual property that you've developed and you can get it valued, by kind of a valuation company or by, showing kind of what the purchase price for it has been, sometimes that can be included. Anything you pay for employees, anything you pay for independent contractors, including anything to like set up those payment systems, like if you need to hire a payroll provider, that can be included. Legal fees, corporate and kind of, business or immigration fees, commercial lease, and you can also kind of prepay your rent. Again, this doesn't work, for example, to say, well, I'm going to have a home office. Can I use my mortgage? Can I use my, residential rent? The answer is no. Those are not good E-2 expenditures. Software, advertising, office supplies. So these are kind of like a generic list of what any business would need. And then you would also want to make sure that you've purchased things that your specific business needs. So for example, like if you had, a photography business or you had a restaurant, you're going to have some specialty items you would obviously need to have to show you've purchased everything necessary to get that type of business up and running. Okay, let's turn to some weak expenditures, things that we would not recommend including. So one would be kind of, flights, anything that's kind of travel related, kind of meals, transportation, entertainment. All of those things are not viewed very favorably, by officers. A car or a vehicle, this may work depending on what the purpose of it is and what type of business you have. So if you're saying I'm buying a car and I need a car to drive to work, that generally is not going to be a strong expense. That being said, if you have a construction business and you need a construction truck, or you have a type of business, you have a mobile dog grooming business, obviously you need a truck, you need a food truck, then a car or vehicle could obviously be included. We'll usually recommend that, if you can purchase it in the name of the business, that would be better. If there's going to be any marketing or branding, wrapping on it, that can also help to show that this is going to be, a business focused vehicle and not a vehicle that's primarily for personal use. Um, Other things we don't recommend, kind of again, like hotels, entertainment, and then expenses paid to related parties. And what we mean here is, let's say that somebody has a company abroad and they're starting a company in the United States, and their company abroad sets up websites. And so they have their US company, pay their company abroad to set up the website. If you and as the investor own both of those companies, it's not that you can't include this, but if this does come to light, they may feel the money's not really at risk. They may feel you're just transferring money from one company you own to another company you own, and no money is really at risk there. So you do want to be, similarly, like if your husband has a business, so you just want to be mindful of that. If you are paying expenses to kind of related parties, just raise that with your attorneys. They can talk about, what are the risks there. All right, let's get into some specific challenges and tips for specific types of businesses. We do a lot of consulting businesses, a lot of service-based businesses, and theoretically, a very low investment is needed to start this business. So a really common question we get is, how could I get the E-2? I want to do a consulting business, but I have a laptop, I have my network, I don't need to spend any money. It's impossible for me to spend the money. And I will say again, like we have been able to get a lot of, clients to a successful result, even though hypothetically, they could have started the business investing a lot less. You really have to consider there's things you would do as an entrepreneur where maybe you're going to want to spend as little as possible. But then if you also want to get the E-2 visa, this is an investor visa. And so you will have to spend, a substantial amount to get the company up and running. So it can be helpful, as I mentioned, to get kind of articles to show, here's the cost for this type of business, and then to show, you spent well in excess of that. You want to, spend more money, even though it may not be necessary at this point in time. One thing we recommend is kind of look forward a year or two to what your operating expenses will be. Maybe you're going to hire a couple employees in year two and you would need to buy computers and printers for them. So maybe you bring some of those, year one and two expenses forward and you just pay for those things now because that's going to be better for your application. So maybe you don't need a new laptop, you were going to wait, a year or so, but you buy yourself a new laptop, or you were going to just start with a really bare bones website, and then kind of ramp it up in year two or three, but you decide, what, I'll bring that expenditure, forward and I'll just do it now. So, you want to invest also in a wide variety of categories to demonstrate that, you've spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. So, again, office space, you can prepay for 6 to 12 months, equipment, marketing, employees. What doesn't work is, for example, to say, I'm going to prepay 12 months of office rent and for a really expensive office, and I'll spend, $50,000 on that, and then I'm going to buy like a computer and some pens. That doesn't work. Like that's going to look really lopsided, to the officer. You really have to think about, again, showing them I've spent money in a wide variety of categories. I spent money on everything necessary to get this business up and running. And most businesses are going to need things like a website, some type of software, some type of hardware, a space to operate, some type of employees. So you want to be thinking about that, in light of the type of business that you're starting. All right, let's turn to real estate businesses. If you are going to do an E-2 for a real estate business, you have to know that there's going to be kind of extra scrutiny on your case from the start. It's even a question on many, consular websites. Can I get an E-2 by just purchasing a property in the United States? So there's often this misconception, I can buy a property and I'm just collecting rental income and I put it in an LLC. Can that be my investment? And the answer is no, because it's not considered a real and operating business. In order to kind of get an E-2, you have to show that the business is going to be a real and operating enterprise. It's going to bring in revenue. It's going to support employees. You're not just kind of holding real estate and collecting kind of rental income, which is seen as a passive activity. So kind of potential ideas that have worked for clients of ours in the past, so one, a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company where you're managing multiple properties. So maybe you have some of your own you're managing, but then you also have contracts to manage other people's properties, a renovation or construction company. Also house flipping if you're doing it on a large scale. So we had a client, for example, that had a portfolio of 20 to 30 homes that they were flipping, and they were able to get an E-2 based on that. That being said, because of the type of business it was, their investment had to be much higher, because they were paying a lot to kind of purchase and flip these homes. If you do want to do house flipping, but you don't really have the amount to invest, or you're not going to do it on a large enough scale, you could consider, for example, starting a renovation company or a construction company, and then having house flipping maybe be kind of an ancillary or side service that you offer. So it's not the main service. So that's something that people will do sometimes. You also want to make sure that you have all the proper licenses. So things like, being a, real estate broker, or if you're doing a construction company, a general contractor, oftentimes you do need these licenses. Sometimes it can be challenging to get them before you have a social security number, before you're in the US. So some of our clients will, for example, partner with other local, individuals or companies to kind of have those licenses until they're able to get them themselves. Very important to kind of consider that in your business plan, so you can explain that to the officer if they ask. All right. We can go back. Yeah, thanks. So for equity trading companies, we're going to see a lot of the same concerns that we have for real estate. So just this question of, is it going to be you just putting, a portfolio into the name of an LLC and doing day trading or personal investing? You want to make sure that your clients are going beyond just friends and family, that you're actually going to be making enough money, to hire workers in the US. And this is, again, a very highly regulated industry to show you have those proper licenses. If you're doing something more complex, like you're doing a hedge fund or something, you're going to have multiple kind of corporate structures, and you'll need to make sure that you're able to explain to the officer how those work together and which one is going to be the operating E-2 company that's going to take in the revenue and hold the employees. All right, so let's turn to some reasons for E-2 visa denials. So one would be low investment amount. As we've talked about, there are strategies you can use to try to mitigate, that risk. However, a lower investment amount will be a higher risk case, and there are some investments that are just too low. We had a client come to us one time who had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. The officer said, please come back when you have spent more money. So we worked with this person, got their investment closer to $50,000. And when they went back, they were approved. So again, just keeping in mind, even if you can argue and make the points to yourself, well, I don't need to spend any more, in order to meet the substantial investment requirement for the E-2 visa, you do need to spend more than just kind of 2,000, 3,000. The nature of the business can also be a reason for an E-2 denial. So as we've talked about today, there are some businesses that they will look at with more scrutiny, including consulting businesses, real estate, equity trading businesses. With consulting, a concern they have is, are you going to create jobs, in the United States? You're going to be a solo consultant. Filing location and venue. So there are certain consulates that are, less friendly to lower investment amounts. Some consulates are used to seeing, large multinational companies that are just sending over kind of dozens or even hundreds of E-2 employees and are investing millions of dollars. Those consulates are going to be less friendly to the small investor who's investing $40,000, $50,000. So you do want to kind of consider filing location and venue, see what options you have. Because of policy changes this year, it's gotten more difficult to apply anywhere except for, your country of nationality or country of residence. But sometimes there are still some options. For example, filing a change of status within the United States, or maybe, kind of filing, where you're living. So you just want to understand with your attorney what are the current trends at the consulate you're filing at, because that will be very impactful to whether you can ultimately get your visa approved. The next two bullet points are kind of related. So kind of, did you run a similar business in your home country and did it never have employees? Like, let's say you have, a very successful consulting career for 10 years as a solo consultant and you never hired anyone. In that scenario, they may not be willing to just rely on the 5-year business plan to say, yes, I think this person is going to, hire people. You may actually want to hire somebody before you apply in that case, just to kind of mitigate that concern ahead of time. So again, like if they don't think that the business is going to create jobs for U.S. workers, or they think, let's say, we had someone come to us once who was denied, and they were trying to buy one of those like small postal offices. Like a UPS, but they only wanted to hire one person, and the business only had a history of hiring one person. That type of thing is not going to be very favorable for an E-2. You could also have issues with the adjudicating officer. So, consular officers are human beings. They have different levels of training. They have different approaches. They have good days and bad days. If you feel like you had an officer that just really, really didn't understand the case, generally your best option is to try to refile. There are very kind of limited abilities to contest an officer's decision, and often there's a lot of discretion involved. So really, if you feel that they got it really wrong, refiling is often the best approach. Most consulates will try to give you a different officer. It's not a guarantee, but they generally do try to do that in our experience. Another might be that you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people will file on their own, or maybe with counsel that's not immigration counsel and may not fully understand the requirements. For example, if you are filing and the entire investment is a loan secured by the E-2 company, you haven't invested any money yet. You didn't meet that requirement at all. Or perhaps if the treaty country investor does not own a majority of, doesn't own 50% of the business or doesn't control the business. At that point, you would need to kind of revisit the filing, see if you can actually rework it to meet those requirements, and refile the case. Okay, let's turn to some adjudication trends. So, government posted approval rates for E-2s are between 80 to 90%. They're, generally have been consistently, high. Our approval rate is around 98%, although of course, past results do not predict future outcome. Nobody can guarantee that your visa will be approved. It will always be a matter of just trying to submit the strongest case possible. In terms of timelines, right now, for example, in London, they're taking about 90 working days from the time you submit your case until they'll allow you to schedule your interview. And then usually you can schedule the interview within a couple weeks of being invited. But again, it is a process of months. Toronto, right now it used to be more consistent. It's a bit less consistent right now, where generally around 15 to 20 business days after you submit your case, you'll get an invite to schedule. Some people are able to schedule within a month. Some people are able to schedule within 2 or 3 months. So that's kind of a moving target right now. In general, for timelines, most consulates at this point are kind of back to where they were before the pandemic. That being said, there are still some outliers. For example, Bogota, sometimes in Turkey, there's been a bit of a delay still. So there are certain places where it's still kind of several months or more, when you're submitting your application. So you do want to kind of, check in with that particular consulate, see what the processing times are. We're about to head into the holiday season and things do slow down during that time as well. So you want to be planning ahead and thinking kind of in months, not days or weeks when you are submitting your case. Um, Moving to filing with USCIS versus filing with a consulate. So if you're filing with USCIS, what you're filing for is a change of status or maybe an extension of status if you already are on an E-2. And this is only available to you if you are already in the United States in a status that allows you to change your status. So let's say you entered on ESTA, for example, to open your business bank account. You cannot change your status from ESTA. That's not permitted. But let's say you entered on a B1 visa and for whatever reason, you decided, you know what, I'd rather do a change of status and go back to the consulate, then that could be an option for you. Kind of some benefits of USCIS are they are friendlier to lower investment amounts. That being said, if you get an approval from USCIS, what you're getting is a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the United States and run the business. Once you leave the United States, let's say 1 year in, you have to leave, you would have to go to a consulate and submit a brand new application. And the consulate does not have to rely on the USCIS approval. They will look at your case as a brand new case. So let's say after 1 year, the business hasn't done that well, you would have to submit that to the consulate. And that could potentially, make it for a weaker E-2 case. Another thing with USCIS is they are very, very strict on the source and trail of funds. So they really want to see an exact accounting of where the money came from, where it was sustained, and the exact trail to the investor through to when it is spent on the E-2 expenditures. So for example, if you have personal savings from employment, they're going to want to see your not just your tax returns, but also kind of your pay stubs, the money entering your business bank or the money entering your personal account and being maintained there. If you transferred it to savings accounts, they would want to see that trail. So it can get quite complicated for USCIS source and trail of funds if you have kind of a lot of different sources of funds or they went through a lot of different bank accounts. With a consulate, a benefit there is you're going to get an actual visa stamp that allows for international travel. And for many countries, that means a multi-year, multi-entry visa. So this can often be a more attractive option to people, who are, needing to travel and don't want to just be kind of stuck in the United States. Some consulates are friendlier to lower investment amounts. Our experience is that USCIS is kind of the most friendly towards that. But again, it has to make sense in light of the business. Consulates also tend to take a more holistic view of the source and trail of funds. So, whereas USCIS would want kind of all that paperwork showing kind of the pay stubs and the maintaining in the bank account, a consulate may be more satisfied just with the tax returns and proof of you transferring your money to the business bank account. So these are all kind of strategy considerations to go over, with your attorney. One other kind of thing about USCIS that can be attractive is that you can pay for premium processing to get a response within 15 business days. And that can be an approval, denial, or request for more evidence. If it's a request for more evidence, then you would submit the evidence and they'll usually issue a final decision 15 business days after that. So if you are in the United States, you have a kind of simpler source and trail of funds, you have maybe a lower investment amount, and you're not as concerned about international travel, USCIS may be a good option, but something to consider. So for post-specific considerations, always look at the consulate website and the consular instructions. So these will often change over time. Page limits will change, formatting will change, and consulates are getting pickier and pickier. They will send it back to you or not adjudicate it if it is not in the format that they require. Um, Also, you want to just be aware of consular preferences. So, as I've mentioned a couple times throughout the presentation, some consulates are more familiar with, bigger companies. They want higher investment amounts. Some are more familiar with the kind of smaller investors, and this does change over time. So there are, the consular officers and consular chiefs and foreign service officers will rotate, through different consulates, and there are trends that will kind of come up, and then things can change. So always important to kind of talk to your attorney to understand, what's going on at that particular consulate at that particular point in time. Um, Another thing is that some consulates require a CPA to certify your business plan. So Mexico comes to mind, as one of the consulates that requires this. So when they ask for that 5-year business plan, they actually want those financials validated by a CPA. It is a service that we offer to draft business plans, where the investor will kind of present to us, here's what our plan is, and we'll help turn that into an E-2 compliant business plan. And we also do have a CPA on staff to do that certification if it's needed. Okay, let's turn to some issues in complex areas with E2s, things that come up a lot. So people will ask, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E2 visa? And the answer is no, you don't. That being said, there are some consulates that take a different view. So for example, the American Institute in Taiwan comes to mind, where they will often harp on this, or sometimes officers have a misunderstanding about people needing to be hired ahead of time. So it is not a requirement, but it is a strength for your case. And depending on what type of consulate you're applying at, you may want to consider more strongly actually hiring someone before you apply, although it is not a requirement. Complicated source and trail of funds. So as I kind of just mentioned, for USCIS filings, they really want to see every single piece of documentation. Even if you say, well, this was an inheritance from, a family member 20 years ago, they're going to want to see the full trail. So again, if you have a very complex source and trail of funds, USCIS may be, not a good option for you. Loans and gifts, are permissible. The loans have to be unsecured or secured by the investor's personal assets, but they cannot be secured by the E2 company. Gifts are permissible, but the gift giver has to show where they got the money. Um, E2 investors for E2 visas for 2 investors. So this is possible if the ownership is 50-50. If it's not 50-50, then the 2 investor structure wouldn't work. But if they have the same nationality, for example, if it's 2 Canadians, you could consider, for example, an investor visa and an employee visa. But if you have 2 different nationalities, that would not work. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes people will kind of get a visa, especially if it's a 5-year visa, and they think, great, I'm authorized to work. But what you have to remember is you are authorized to work for the company that you presented to the consulate and in the area you presented to the consulate. So, if you change your ownership and you no longer own 50% and you no longer control the company, that even if you have a 5-year visa, if you do that 3 years in and now you only own 20% and your US citizen partner owns 80%, that visa is no longer valid because your company is no longer meeting the E2 requirements. Similarly, a major change in the type of business. So let's say you're running a wedding photography business and now you want to shut it down and open a restaurant. You cannot do that without first getting an approval from USCIS or the consulate, even if you're doing it under the same LLC. Similarly, having your E2 visa does not mean you can just open up lots of other companies and work for those companies. You can work for the E2 company, and there are things you can do. There are structures you can put in place. For example, if you're going to be providing kind of management services to multiple different companies in a portfolio, you can put those into place. But you want to strategically talk about this with your attorney as opposed to just opening up companies. And then at the renewal stage, might find out, hey, there's a risk here that it will say, it will show that I violated my status by working for these companies without, having authorization. So you really want to, any major changes you're planning, you want to discuss with your attorney before you make those changes. Family business purchases we talked about, so just if you are purchasing a business from a family member, get a valuation, have a reasonable explanation for that purchase price to show that it is a substantial investment that you're making. Um, in terms of the impact of the administration, we've had a lot of executive orders about kind of enhanced vetting. So this is something where any visa applicant needs to be, very clear on what is their immigration history. If you've ever had any criminal history or any criminal touch of any kind, this is coming up more, even if in prior visas it wasn't an issue. So just kind of be mindful of your entire profile is going to undergo kind of enhanced scrutiny at this point in time. A higher investment and higher employee numbers is something that is always going to strengthen your case, but particularly in this environment where they're really looking to see, how is your business going to make the U.S. more prosperous? They really are going to want to, see that. So the more that you can invest, the more people you can hire, the stronger your case will be. Also better to invest in the United States. So again, making the US prosperous is kind of something the consular officers are focusing on. So they will want to see, yes, you've actually invested, in the United States. Approval rates really didn't change much from 2016 to 2020. Obviously we're, kind of in a bit of a different environment now, but we have not seen a change to approval rates at this point in time. All right. It doesn't look like any questions have come in, so I think we will close here. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, Katie, for joining, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.